Okay, so I was speaking to some senior coalition figures in the past week or so, and they indicated to me that had they been in power, which of course they're not, so it's a moot point, but if they were in power, they would probably in this budget deliver a budget surplus. Do you get a sense that there's any idea the federal government today, the Labor government, could produce a surplus?
Look, I think that's certainly the public indications I've seen have ruled that out. And it's always interesting to play budget hypotheticals. But I think that, we've seen in the past the difference between a smaller deficit and a slight surplus are not necessarily material. So the main thing will be around the quality, I think, of the decisions that have been made. We've had a clear indication that the deficit is going to be smaller. And I think that's a good thing in terms of the current economic environment that we're in.
So the October budget handed down, which is the first one from Jim Chalmers, also was unusual in the fact it showed out to 10 years into the future there would be no budget surplus. Now, this, of course, is not the sort of discipline that the likes of Moody's or Standard & Poor's would like to see, and it just means that the debt of Australia continues to rise. Do you get a sense that the government now would at least like to try and aim to have a surplus in those out years, because really that's about their credibility for managing the economy?
Yeah, I think this is going to become an increasing focus from this budget onwards. And really, when you look at that $50 billion fiscal gap, we do need to do something about it. And part of that comes down to growing the economy faster and lifting productivity, obviously. But there are going to need to be some policy decisions made over the long term in terms of where we take, for example, the tax space and also what we do on spending. So it is actually going to be really important. The intergenerational report comes out in the second half of this year, and I think that will really set the scene for just how big that task is in the medium term and the implications if we don't start to get on top of that in the medium term, which could be significant.
Well, your pre-budget report is called Closing the Gap, which is actually closing that fiscal gap, if you like. Now, the point that you make is if they don't get on top of this, that ultimately the interest bill of Australia is going to be more than we spend on aged care or on Medicare, which are the key priorities with an ageing population.
That's right, Ross, and I'm no debt alarmist here, but when you look at the opportunity cost around interest payments and how prominently interest payments feature in the top spending programs, that's where you start to look at it and think, well, we do need to make some progress here. We're not necessarily going to eliminate debt all in one hit and very quickly, but we do need to make progress and bring it down. And economic growth is starting to do that, but we need to look at how we close that fiscal gap over the next decade, which will make a big contribution to that.
OK, then go to inflation, because quite clearly inflation deflates debt. And so, therefore, in some ways, a bit of inflation, if you're trying to control your debts, can be a good thing, so long as on the other side you've actually got the economic growth and you don't erode your taxpayer base, which at the moment it seems to be happening. The question is whether that's realistic in the medium and the long term.
Yeah, I mean, all signs in terms of policy are that we want to get inflation under control. So I don't think we'd want to be baking in any kind of assumptions around permanently higher inflation. So absolutely, it can play a role, and it has played a role in a lot of other countries' sort of immediate debt reduction in history. But we'd certainly want to get on top of the inflation issue, because that is causing a whole lot of pain throughout the economy. And once it becomes baked in, it's very hard to get out.
OK, so just explain one thing, because the Treasurer, in all of his rhetoric and talking about this budget, really talks about the long-term budget pressures that are there. Now, one of those we talked about is interest rates. The other is obviously the cost of healthcare, Medicare, but then clearly the NDIS and defence spending. So you can see that there's big cost pressures that will come down the pipeline on the federal government unless they can make certain that the economy grows faster and that they've got the debts under control.
Well, that's right. They've got to pull a whole bunch of levers here in terms of starting to close that fiscal gap. I mean, one, they do need to evaluate spending programs more often and make sure that we're getting value for money from those. And we're starting to see that. Obviously, there's a significant review around the NDIS. They are also looking at Medicare. We've seen that report come out recently as well. But we do have to get the economy growing faster, and the best way to do that is through productivity, because then we don't have the issues around inflation. And then we've also got to look at the suitability of the tax base, particularly given the ageing population that we have.
And so do you sense that there is significant tax reform around the corner from this government, especially, say, for example, they've won the Aston by-election. If they get the Voice through, their popularity, they're going to have significant political capital, shall I say, to make big changes?
Well, certainly they're building some momentum. I mean, there was a bit of courage, I think, shown with the changes to super tax concessions. And so we really think that if they use the intergenerational report in the second half of the year to really set out where the challenges are and what the actual challenges for the tax system are over coming decades, you can really use that document to start to build the case for tax reform and the objectives that it needs to meet. Because so often we get into this debate and we go straight to particular tax bases that we would all like to change. And economists are guilty of this more than anyone. But we actually need to start with what is it that we're trying to achieve, and then I think we can look at how we pursue that through the tax system.
Jarrod Ball, Chief Economist at the Committee for Economic Development in Australia. Good to have you on the program, Jarrod. Many thanks for your time.
Great to be with you, Ross.